And welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Still Curtain podcast. I'm your host, Tommy Jaggi, editor of StillCurtain.com. And joining me, as always, is Still Curtain contributor Shayne Kubas. Shayne, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances, but you called it, and I called it, and millions of fans out there called it.
Yeah.
We were bound to have another season that was kind of exactly what we've seen from this team over the past 8 years. And so that 8-year drought without a playoff win for Pittsburgh continues, but it gets worse than that. This team has 3 playoff wins now over the last 14 seasons. I want to break some of those down a little bit later. I mean, we talk about Coach Tomlin here later in the show and what the Steelers need to do. We're gonna focus this show, Shayne, on the coaching changes that need to happen for the Steelers, not necessarily the ones that will. We'll make our predictions about what will happen, but what has to happen for this team to turn things around. And we're going to start with coaching first because that's kind of first on the dock around the NFL right now. After Black Monday, everybody's firing coaches. The Steelers should join them by doing some firings at the very least to actually inspire real change. We'll see whether or not they will, but we're going to talk about the Steelers versus Ravens game today, Steelers draft pick that they have now that they've been officially eliminated from the playoffs, what happened, what went wrong during their winter meltdown, and all the changes that they need to make right now. We're going to table, though, the free agent moves and more of the roster stuff for later because we're going to fill a whole show today. We're not going to have any problem with that.
Yeah, we'll have plenty of time to talk about the specifics of moves, like who we're looking at from a coaching perspective, from player acquisition perspective. We'll have plenty of time to do that between now and the draft. Also talking about the draft, we mentioned the pick we know now have. We know where we're picking. We'll talk about that in a minute. But today it's all about kind of just dissecting how the season ended the way that it did, and more specifically why, obviously. So,
all right, Shayne, let's start with the wild card loss to the Ravens. This game was far worse than the score would lead any box score checker to believe at the end of the game. Now, Wilson ended up salvaging his numbers, completed 20 of 29 passes, 270 yards, pair of touchdowns. That's all good and well. But when you start the game off 21-0, you dig yourself into a hole entering the tunnel at halftime. That game's over. And at no point after those first couple drives did it feel like the Steelers stood anything close to resembling a chance to compete in the playoffs for the umpteenth year in a row. And it's beyond frustrating at this point. Last year was more excusable. You were starting Mason Rudolph, who was legitimately your third string quarterback. You were without TJ Watt. You were playing the Bills in Buffalo. This was completely inexcusable. And it's getting to the point where we're just beyond tired of the same old song and dance with this team. But a 28-14 loss is what it is with the Pittsburgh. Shayne, just give me your overarching thoughts about this game.
I think the thing that I thought the most during the actual game was just the fact that you could tell that this team simply wasn't good enough to compete with this team. Like, we're not on the same level as them from a roster perspective and from a schematic perspective. And I think the effort level also kind of started to wane pretty quickly by the defense. And honestly, with how easily they were being taken advantage of by the Ravens, I'm not that surprised that the effort level started to wane, because it became clear very early on that they just couldn't compete physically with them, and they weren't able to kind of crack the Ravens running code, which, to be fair, I don't know if any team is going to necessarily do that in these playoffs. I feel like the run game is going to work for them about as well as they want it to. It's just whether other things break their way the rest of the way. But yeah, it became very clear throughout the game that even when we made some plays on offense and we started to get things going there, that the defense was not going to get a stop. Like, they were not going to be able to stop this team enough times in a row to let them get back in the game. And especially you go down 21-0. I mean, the expectation is that you're going to lose at that point, obviously. Like, most teams aren't coming back from that. Certainly not this team, that despite some fireworks in the middle of the season and even in this game, just wasn't good enough offensively to come back from a deficit like that.
Yeah, and what's so concerning at this point, Shayne, is the Steelers have dug themselves into incredible deficits in every recent playoff game that Mike Tomlin has played, every single one of them. And during that span, I can't remember, is it during that 8-year window? I have to look at the figure exactly, but 38.8 points, I believe, is what the Steelers have been surrendering in the playoffs during that drought. It's inexcusable. You've got the league's highest paid defense. You have resources invested there. And I think that we're going to have to point some fingers at the coaching. Are there holes? Absolutely. Are there positions that need to be fixed? Yes. But it starts up top. It starts up front. We're going to talk about what changes this team can make. We're going to break down the game in more detail in just a little bit here. But let's continue on with the rest of the trending Steelers news this week. And the Steelers hold now the 21st overall pick in the NFL draft.
Feels like we do every year.
You're destined for it, Shayne. I mean, it's right in that range. So
from like 17 to 23, somewhere around that. I feel like
I've got their draft history right here. Let's go down through it because this team never picks. And I know there's an argument going around right now too, and based on Tomlin's comments from his presser, where he didn't even give a second thought to saying, no, we don't need a bad season to get a quarterback. Lamar Jackson was drafted pick 30 or 32, and Jalen Hurts went in the second round. That was his reasoning. But at the same time, this team they're plateauing every single year. And almost every year is exactly the same. In 2020, they didn't have a first-round pick. Their second-round pick was a pick 49. 2021, they had pick 24 in the draft. In 2022, they had pick 20. In 2023, they moved from 17 to 14 for Broderick Jones. Last year, they had pick 20. This year, they have pick 21. It's all about the same, and we'll see what they can do with that. The only way that could have changed after the Steelers were officially eliminated was if the Commanders had beaten the Bucs in that game. They would have moved up one more spot. So don't know how big of a difference that's going to make in the grand scheme of things, but that's where they're sitting right now.
Just again, like fans of the team know, like that's where we pick. Like we pick in that range, and like at the end of the day, like we'll get to the Tomlin's comments here in a second about his press conference in general, but I understand where he's coming from. But there's a reason why, teams draft quarterbacks in the top 5 typically and not in, the second round, because it's usually hard to get those guys in the second round. But yeah,
and it's easier to move up for a quarterback if you're picking 12 or 14 rather than when you're picking in the 20s, because then it just takes that much more draft capital. You can look at these charts that show the value of each pick, and it takes a lot to move up near the top of the draft if the Steelers were ever in a position to do that. Now, there have been opportunities. Obviously, I was a huge Lamar Jackson advocate back in 2018 when I think Ben Roethlisberger was 36 years old at the time, and you don't wait until the last possible second. You have to try to make proactive moves, and the Steelers were too short-sighted, in my opinion, where they would go year to year and not give a second thought about the future. There were opportunities to take quarterbacks along the way. Each of these past 5 years now, really, they could have done it, and they missed those opportunities. They ended up taking a quarterback, obviously, with pick 20 in the 2022 draft, which, in my opinion, the worst draft class I've ever graded out in terms of the quarterbacks in the class, and it ended up being a colossal disaster for Pittsburgh. So we'll see if they can get that right. That we're going to save that for a different podcast, because we can literally do a whole podcast about the quarterback position and what this team needs to do. I'm sure we will do that very soon. Actually, we'll talk about who are the potential candidates and who's most likely to be here and what the Steelers should do there. But let's move on, Shayne, and talk about Mike Tomlin's press conference real quick. His postseason press conference he just had this week. He gave the answers that you would expect Mike Tomlin to give, threw in a lot of Tomlinisms and cliches that he typically does, and kind of beat around the bush on some things. He didn't really give way to what firings could be coming. He knows that his job is safe. That's for sure. And when asked about that, I believe it was Brooke Pryor who asked Tomlin about the teams inquiring about his services, and his answer was essentially save your time. You're not going anywhere. And I just don't know. I guess you're so grandfathered into the coaching position at this point. But if you have 8 straight seasons without a playoff win, I don't feel like anybody should be able to be so confident that their job is safe. Bill Belichick couldn't. Pete Carroll couldn't. And so that's the problem. Even guys who are in positions like they're in and with the reputation they have, nobody's job should be safe if you are not producing the playoff success that a team needs to produce. I just don't know if anybody would have been given this long. But what were your big takeaways from Tomlin's press conference? Anything that strike you there?
Just that I expect this offseason, for the most part, to be very similar to every other Steelers offseason. He didn't give me any indication that things are going to change in any sort of significant way. He didn't give any indication, like you mentioned, that major changes are coming. I think coaches that aren't under contract right now probably won't be under contract with this team going into next season. They're probably not bringing anybody back that they don't have to or that isn't already under contract. But I also expect everybody who currently has a contract will probably be here. I don't expect any actual major firings. We'll talk about that, specifically what we think they should do and what we actually think will happen here later in the show. But as far as, major changes coming, don't expect anything from the Steelers in that regard. And I think Tomlin's comments about his job security confirms what we all already knew, which is that despite rumors, despite people in the media talking about whether or not they should or will or can or whatever, nothing's changing with who the head coach of this team is, and probably isn't changing anytime soon.
Yeah, the one thing I think, Shayne, is probably worth mentioning that Tomlin did praise Justin Fields. He does believe in him, according to his words, that he could be a quarterback who leads this team as a starter. We'll see what comes of that. I think it's probably likely that the Steelers bring back either Wilson or Fields. I think it's probably unlikely they bring back both, because that's literally what they had this year and it wasn't good enough. And so I think they're going to want some changes at the position for sure. But Fields obviously is a player you can keep an eye on, still 25 years old, wasn't given that chance late in the season. They stuck with Russell through all the bumps and hiccups there, and it did not work out as planned. And so we'll talk about that later on a different show. The other thing, Shayne, before we move on to our topics for today, Arthur Smith just wrapped up his head coaching interview with the Chicago Bears. He's got another one tomorrow with the New York Jets, and kudos to you guys. I know your coaching has been bad. If you want to poach Art, by all means, be my guest. I know the Steelers can do a lot worse, Shayne, in terms of offense core. We literally seen it. I mean, this team has gone through Randy Fichtner and Matt Canada, but Arthur Smith did not have a good year. He did not even have an encouraging year, because this team was less effective at running the football, which is supposed to be Smith's forte. They were less effective in play action situations, which again, that's what he's supposed to be able to bring to the table. Obviously, the personnel has something to do with that. You can't run an offense without a number 2 receiver very well, or even a number 3 receiver for that matter. Pickens missed a stretch of games there. They were missing several offensive linemen. So all of that stuff factors in. I don't want to be too hard on Smith in his first season, but the Steelers offense this year, Shayne, finished 23rd in yards allowed, 16th in points allowed. They were a very middling offense. And in fact, you have to go back 5 seasons to his time with the Tennessee Titans, where he produced an offense that was collectively inside the top 20. This is the guy that teams are interviewing for a head coaching position.
I think it's very interesting because, again, like with Smith, I view him and have viewed him really since his time in Tennessee, since he left, as a guy who he'll get about what you have out of the offense. Where if your offense is really, really good or has a special player like a Derrick Henry in his case for the Titans, he will get about what you expect out of that offense for the most part. If you have less than desirable pieces like the Steelers have, you get less than desirable results. So I think he's it's kind of funny. He's almost very similar to Tomlin in the sense that he's a floor raiser in some ways. Like he brings you to the floor of what you should be, but he doesn't really have the tools to elevate an offense. I don't think his scheme elevates them. I don't think that his ability as a motivator or as an actual teacher of men is going to be able to elevate people. He hasn't shown that. So it's very interesting to me that he's getting head coaching offers after the season he had. Because there was a point in the season where if you looked at the numbers, like, oh, man, the Steelers' offense is so much better than it was last year. And it's like, technically, yes, but also, like, the quarterback position, despite the issues that we're going to talk about with that group, was still so much better than it had been the past couple of years. The offensive line was playing better, especially at that point in the season. Like, there's other factors there than just Smith coming in. It's not like he had the exact same pieces as Canada had and things like that. So,
yeah, it was going to be better by default. And John chimes in here. Smith isn't new. He isn't a new innovative mind. He can bounce. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, he's becoming a retread at this point. We saw his 3 years in Atlanta, and all 3 years that team finished with a 7-10 record when he was a head coach.
Yeah,
I don't know what's so enticing about it. I guess I don't understand what.
To be fair, those teams are casting some of the widest nets that I've ever seen. So like,
Yeah, they are. They
to
are.
be
They're looking
fair,
for
yeah.
anybody that can raise the floor of
Yeah.
those
It,
organizations in Chicago and
at
in New
this
York.
point, I won't be surprised if one of us gets a call the way this is going. Like this is it's getting kind of ridiculous with some of the stuff I've heard from, especially the Jets. So like, we'll see if Smith actually is
Yeah.
a serious contender for any of these jobs. I did see some. I couldn't tell you who because there's too many things going on at the same time. But I believe someone in the media the other day said that they think Smith actually has a chance for the Jets job, which I'm like, hey, you know what? You can have him if you want him. That's kind of where I'm at with
Yeah.
him at this point. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's we knew it was obvious at the time, but it's even more so. It's confirmed at this point. Tomlin's hire of Arthur Smith was to appease his game plan, which was to play conservative football and to not turn the ball over, which they didn't do. Congratulations, you had 6 interceptions in 17 games with Russell Wilson and Justin Fields as your quarterback. Maybe 7. I can't. It's one of those two.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't matter at the end of the day if you can't score points, which the Steelers were scoring 14 points over the last 5 games of the season and into the playoffs. It's not going to get the job done. And that's the same exact argument that we had the 2 years of Kenny Pickett and Mitch Trubisky. You can't play risk-free football and expect to actually be a competitive team that competes when it matters. And so we saw the results kind of worked out just the way that we thought they would. So anything else you want to share on that, Shayne, before we move on here?
No, we'll get more into, the offense and what faltered and kind of how things fell apart down the stretch. But in general, again, Arthur Smith is, I would say, maybe an average coordinator at best. And, I talked about that even whenever the offense looked better than it did down the stretch. That certainly didn't change my mind. That's all I have to really say about that. So,
yeah, 100%. Let's talk about the Steelers-Ravens notes real quick here. And this will be our last time doing these notes until we get back into the preseason, and we'll kind of do this routine here again. But let's start with the offense, Shayne, and quarterback Russell Wilson. Like I said already, he salvaged his stats. He put together a respectable performance, but it was far too late in the game to warrant anything that should be considered really towards his future at all. Like, this was not a statement game. You can't go a whole first half getting pulverized in time of possession, not being able to move the chains, and having 48 yards, I think it was in the first half, something to the tune of that, and then put together some garbage yards in the second half. I don't care. I don't care what he did. I don't care that he had 121.3 pass rating. It means nothing to me in this game because you were so grossly outmatched in the beginning of this contest. You were an incompetent offense. And I do point the finger largely at the 36-year-old quarterback who this team brought on to be that starter and who they moved on from Justin Fields to ensure that Wilson had a shot to show himself in the postseason, and he did not, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think the problem ultimately for Wilson is at this point in his career, there was no way that he was going to play well enough to win this game. Like, they're just, you could tell from the get-go, like, he just doesn't have that same ability that he had in Seattle. Last 2 years in Denver obviously showed a lot of that, but again, like, he's a very specific quarterback at this point. There's specific things he can do very well still. He can still throw the ball down the field. You saw that in this game in the second half. You saw it throughout the season. And he can still sort of make plays a little bit as a runner sometimes. The problem is, especially for the Steelers, is I think he did that a little too much sometimes, especially the other game against the Ravens, the most recent one, when he fumbled trying to score, that stuff. Like, he took a little too much in that situation, and he still does at times. He's a check down or throw down the field quarterback at this point in his career, and that just doesn't work consistently in the NFL. And we'll talk about some of the numbers here when we get to, why the Steelers collapsed and what caused it. And I have some throughout there. I'm sure you do too, but it's just very easy watching him. Like, he just doesn't do enough things well at this point in his career to contend against a team that was playing at the level the Ravens were playing at.
Yeah. I mean, Wilson's kind of the path of his whole season with the Steelers. He lives and dies by that YOLO ball.
He does.
If it's not working, he will have a terrible game. If he hits it 2 or 3 times, he'll have a respectable performance, but it's not sustainable. And that's what we've been saying. The Steelers tried really their philosophy was the same with Pickett. Pickett's best games came when he hit a few of those sideline balls down to George Pickens, but everything else, the stuff over the middle of the field wasn't good. The consistency from play to play wasn't good. The drive consistency. And so we saw the same struggles this year. And I'm not impressed. I'm not intrigued. I want no part of this for the future, especially considering Wilson's going to turn 37 next year. And we'll have those discussions as well. But no, I was not just because he salvaged the numbers. I don't think it was a good game overall from Wilson. I don't think that he was the only problem. There were so many in this game to look at. So the running game is one of them. 11 carries for 29 yards. I mean, first of all, you run the ball the fourth most often of any team in the league. You only ran the ball 11 times this game, partly because you got down so much. But to run for 2.6 yards a carry, it's baffling, even with the offensive line injuries, that this team was so incredibly ineffective at running the football in the second half of the season. Like, their rushing efficiency completely tanked. It wasn't even worth doing. It was as a wasted play, essentially. And so to see it collapse like that, I mean, that's kind of a statement on everybody there. And I think that inspires change in itself.
Yeah, the run game in general, not just this game, but like you said, down the stretch, it became a situation, especially after Najee's kind of hot stretch he had in the middle of the season. It was very clear that the reason why he was so good in those games is because he just happened to break a million tackles because of how he is as a player, like who he is as a player. If you look at those games, so many of those runs were like, I'm just better than the player in front of me in that moment. And you have to give him credit for that. But it kind of goes back to, what is Arthur Smith really doing here? Like, what is he bringing to the run game? Because Jaylen Warren, he had injuries, but he didn't have as good of a season as he's had in the past with us. For some reason, Cordero Patterson was getting carries late in the season in important moments. And, no offense to him, but he's just not that guy anymore. And Najee's not a good fit for the scheme, and was basically relying on the fact that, again, he can break tackles that are at one of the highest rates in the league. But it doesn't matter when he's not getting past the line most of the time. Like, when the offensive line isn't playing well enough to give him the opportunity to break tackles, the offense doesn't work. The run game doesn't work because, again, Warren wasn't making as many big plays. He wasn't as healthy to do so anyway. Everything about the run game this year just kind of felt like more of the same, but even worse in some cases, like you said, because at least before, the scheme made sense for a guy like Najee and Warren. And this year it didn't really make sense for at least Najee, and he wasn't able to break enough tackles down the stretch to make it work.
Yeah, Shane, I think maybe the biggest factor here is the strength of schedule. Like, in that first half of the schedule, we knew that the Steelers, both you and I said, the Steelers need to start the season like 6-2, which they did. But they fell apart even worse than we thought that they could down the stretch, which was really bad. I mean, you lose 5 straight games over in the last 6 games to close out the season. The Steelers were averaging 164 passing yards, and so it was really, really rough. But for rushing efficiency, when they played good teams, they were just outmanned. They couldn't do anything. Nothing was working right, and so they were bullied. And they paid the price there. They found the results. Shane, in terms of the receiving game here, 5 targets for George Pickens. He caught all 5 passes for 87 yards. Probably should throw to him more, even though this was one game removed from the 6-target, 3-drop game against the Bengals, where he had 0 receiving yards on 1 reception. And so just not enough game-to-game consistency from Pickens. If you go back and watch this film, some of it is just he's just not getting open. And so that's an issue there. Chalk it up to effort if you want to. Chalk it up to not being much better of a route runner 3 years into your career as you were when you started. Like, there are deeply rooted issues in this wide receiving core, even with George Pickens specifically. Mike Williams had the 137-yard reception in this game, which really that kind of gave the Steelers a little bit of a spark in the second half, but that was about it in terms of their big plays. Van Jefferson also his 30-yard touchdown reception. So they did capital. I mean, they did have some big connections in this game, but they were so few and far between and so late in the game that it just didn't matter.
Yeah, it kind of felt like, and I'm not sure if you've seen this before, it's kind of an old one at this point, but the meme of Chris Paul hitting a 3 to cut the lead to like 36 in the one playoff series a few years back. That's kind of what those touchdowns felt like. Yeah. It's like, oh, a huge play to cut the lead down to 14. It's like, who cares? Like it, and I hate to say who cares because you love big plays and you want to see the team fight, but like everyone watching that game knew those touchdowns didn't matter. We knew that the defense, we had watched enough of it in this game. Like they're not getting enough stops, right? They're just not going to. There's no way. And even if they do, the offense is going to be that drive that they need desperately that they're going to falter. Like it just, again, like this team was built on the back of multiple high variance situations, turnovers on defense and big plays on offense. You cannot assume you're going to get those often enough to build a game plan around them. And that's what they do, though. That's what all their success is built around. You look at this team over the past however many years, on defense, they force turnovers, or TJ Watt gets a sack, or Alex Highsmith gets a sack, or whoever. They kill a drive, and then the offense gets a big play. Like that's how they've been able to win games in the past. And when you play that way, and you don't have enough built around to do more than that, or you don't have a game plan or a way to fight back when you're not getting those consistently enough, this is what happens. Teams who can do 8 different things well will beat you down, like the Ravens did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and speaking of the offense here and the passing game, it was very clear that the Ravens shifted their defensive philosophy midway through the third quarter. They knew the game was over. They wanted to put the game on ice at that point and make sure their players got away as quickly from this contest as possible, healthy and ready to go against Buffalo this week. And so it's hard to put too much stock in anything that this team did in the second half, because the
Really,
Ravens they kind of took their foot off the gas and said, yeah, we got this one in the bag, and let's get out of here and let's be healthy for the divisional round. So let's shift over to the defensive side of the ball, Shayne. And there were some really bad performances, which goes without saying when Derrick Henry rushes for as many yards as he did. The team ran for 299 yards against the Steelers, most ever in a playoff game. It was pathetic. It truly was. And so just seeing them shoot through right up the middle of the defense, and that was even with the edges crashing down on the running back, they still couldn't get there in time for the defensive line and the linebackers to fill the gaps. Like, it was just a sorry excuse for a game in terms of a run defense. And I've got some stats on here, Shayne, that I wanted to share, but I think I'm going to save them for when we talk about Terrell Austin here in a little bit. So let's keep it to the players for now. We'll talk about Terrell Austin a little bit. Patrick Queen, miserable in this game. I know he was dealing with the flu. I really hope Minka was as well, because he looked like a sorry excuse for a safety in this contest. It looked like he was going half effort out there when you go and watch the game again. It was just a bad performance.
I think the worst part about this performance for the defense is, and like you said, we'll talk about Terrell Austin and some of the other things with the coaching, from a coaching perspective, but this has really for a long time been a player-driven defense. This has been a defense that has been built around the backs, or built upon the backs of some of the best defensive players at their position in the NFL. TJ Watt, Cam Hayward, Minka Fitzpatrick. For a while, those three were about as good of a three on defense as you could get in the sport. And this year, at times, they weren't, especially Minka, obviously. He's been the one that's kind of, I would say, faltered the most in the recent seasons. But those three are just simply not good enough, as good as they can be, to offset some of the issues the rest of the defense has. And you saw that in this game where, Patrick Queen, I know he was dealing with a lot. I'm not going to get on him as much as I probably would otherwise, because I understand playing the sport is very hard without needing multiple IVs before the game. But again, like you said with Minka, at this point, I understand what his role is on this team, and I understand that because of what his role is on this team, that some of the turnover numbers and some of the other things may not be there all the time. But he just simply was not good enough this year to justify the contract that he currently has. And I do think that's something that the team has to look at, and they have to kind of decide if that's something that's going to continue to happen, frankly. But again, that's kind of more of an offseason discussion. But in general, they just had no way to stop the run game. They crashed down on the running back. It didn't matter. They tried to stop Lamar. They handed it off to Henry, and he ran free in the secondary. They were simply not good enough up front to impede either of those guys. And once they were on the edge, they're just better than them. Henry's better than the defense is. Lamar is more athletic than anyone on the defense is. There's nothing they could do once they got into space.
Yeah, completely bullied. And I think what makes this so challenging, Shayne, about how to fix these issues is because you literally have two teams that can win in polar opposite ways. The Ravens can do everything. They can beat you through the air or by running. Especially running game
now, more than ever.
Fantastic. Yeah. It's as good as it's ever been. And you've got a Hall of Fame running back right now who just came off the best season of his career. But looking forward, knowing that the Bengals are going to bounce back with Joe Burrow in an elite passing game,
you assume so,
you can either decide to say, yeah, we're going to stop the Bengals, or yeah, we're going to stop the rushing attack. But if you try to build to stop the Ravens rushing attack, you're going to get killed through the air against Cincinnati. You try to build through a good pass defense, you're going to get killed on the ground against the Ravens. There's not a perfect answer here, but it's very, very clear. Larry Ogunjobi, you don't got it, man. You can't hold up against the run. Isaiah Loudermilk has never been good enough. But in that role player position, you can upgrade that spot. There's guys that have to improve, and there's guys who have to be replaced on this defense. Cam Hayward is not going to last forever. And even with Hayward playing some of his peak football, I mean, they were just getting gashed. He just couldn't do anything to help slow down the rushing attack in this game. So that's really what it came down to. Like you said, won't be too hard on Queen for getting those 4 bags of IV fluid before the game. Bad performance from Minka, bad performance from Cam Sutton. Questionable.
Yeah, Cam Sutton needs
all around.
to retire, by the way. You need to find something else to do. I'm sorry, buddy.
Yeah, hang it up. It was clearly not worth it for Steelers to bring him in, especially with the off-field stuff. You mix that in as well.
Yeah.
TJ Watt, really, really quiet game from Watt. And he just kind of, I mean, he's quiet down the stretch. There's no other way to put it.
It was a weird.
Some of that is game plan. Some of that is accounting for him. Some of that is fatigue, I'm sure, for a 30-year-old guy playing a 17-game season and hardly ever being able to leave the field. Yeah. But he needed to show more down the stretch. He needed to be that guy for his team, and he just wasn't late in the season.
No, and it's unfortunate because, again, TJ, his season was a very weird one for him. The production overall was a little bit down. The pass rushing metrics were certainly down for him. And again, he talked about it after the game, and kind of, I'm sure we'll hear more about it as the offseason goes on. Like, I think he's acknowledging, like, I need to be used differently than I am right now. Like, he's no longer, I think, able to simply sit on the left side of the defense and go to work. Like, you simply can't do that anymore. And it was never really the best thing in the world to do, despite all the success he had there. I think any type of innovative things or just creative things you can do with somebody like him makes sense to do. But clearly he can't be used the same way anymore and expect to hold up over the course of a season. So I think I'm very curious where that leads. But in general, yeah, his end of season just wasn't good enough by his standards, despite there being reasons for that in some cases.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's hard to make a really good case for Watt, even with the chip rate and the attention that he did draw this season. It just wasn't good enough from a pressure perspective, from a win rate perspective. And it just really, really quiet performances down the stretch. I do think that coaching has a lot to do with that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. I want to get to some of the chats that we have here. We'll back up just a little bit. Dan, the Steelers fan. Speaking of Mike Williams, I was just thinking of this team's win over Washington after the bye. And I'm thinking, like, man, where did the fight and excitement go? 100%. I agree. We were all optimistic. I mean, Williams made one big catch in that game, and it was the game winner. And so we're like, all right, this is a good sign for things to come. It was not. I mean, Williams was essentially non-existent. He had 9 snaps in this game. And so you figure the Steelers kind of burnt that 6th round pick. Now we both agreed that win made the difference in a late round draft pick anyway. But Shayne, if there's one play I could take back of the season, is probably that catch, because this team didn't deserve to make it into the playoffs with as bad as they looked. At least they could have went up a few more spots in the draft. Maybe it would have prompted a little bit more change even. I don't know. Probably not. But it's a worthwhile question for sure. I mean, I think Williams' biggest issue, Shayne, was just couldn't separate. And so you basically, it was a moon ball to him in a contested battle, or it was nothing.
Yeah, the thing with Williams is that, like, he came into the league as a guy who didn't separate very well, but was so physically gifted that it didn't matter most of the time. And now he's not as physically gifted. So that's kind of what you get, right? You get the 50-50 balls sometimes it's more like 60-40 balls with him because of his size and his length and everything. But he's not a number 2 receiver anymore. He was for a very long time. He was a very good one. You could even argue kind of like a 1B to a Keenan Allen with Chargers, but just not that same level of player anymore, and certainly need more out of the receiver 2 position for whoever that happens to be going into next year.
Yeah, I was not excited about that move at the time, Shayne. You knew that. I watched him after that ACL tear and watch how he looked on the Jets in the first half of the season. I'm like, man, this guy just doesn't have any juice left in the tank. No. And so when he runs maybe 4.6, 4.65 at this point, you can't do anything but kind of just throw the ball up to him. He's not going to create separation on defensive backs, and he didn't. And I think that's why he was targeted so infrequently and was used so infrequently, is because of that. We got one from R. Barley here. Calvin Anderson looked to be much better than Dan Moore. Am I nuts? I didn't really focus in on that, honestly. I didn't pay too much attention to Calvin Anderson snaps. That's something I'd have to go back and look at. But Moore had a really rough stretch down the season, really rough stretch. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was at least comparable to what Moore was offering before the injury there.
Yeah.
Here's one from John. A TJ Watt trade should be considered. Shayne, what do you make of that? Because I know that in terms of what's best for the future of this team, if you really want to get back to being a contender again, there's absolutely a case to be made there. Will the Steelers do it? Absolutely no. But what do you think about a TJ Watt trade?
I think the problem with one is simply that this defense doesn't really work without him. You know what I mean? Now, granted, if you want to try to bottom out a little bit and you want to try to completely rebuild, then sure. Like, this is certainly one of the things that I would do, like in Madden, for example. Like, I'd certainly trade TJ like Madden, because you could probably get like 3 first-round picks because it's Madden. But I think the other problem is, as great as TJ is, I don't know what you necessarily get for him. Not in the sense that you wouldn't get enough for him, but he's a very specific player in the way that he plays, and I wonder how many teams across the league would be able to maximize that, or would feel that they can maximize that. And you might not get as much as people would think you would. I mean, he is over 30 now as well. You know, the contract is not as big as some of the other edge contracts now, because it's been a couple years since he signed, but it's still big. You know, I think it would depend on how much you can actually get. If you can get a first round pick plus from a team that's willing to, you know, take the contract on, and also to that they think they can use him effectively enough to be worth that first round pick plus, then you could consider it, but it's also not going to happen. So
yeah, no, that would be very, very uncharacteristic of a franchise that more than any team in the league values players who can start and finish their career with the team if they are that Hall of Fame type talent, and TJ is. Yeah. So should it be considered? Yes, it should be considered, I believe, because this team is not very close to winning a Super Bowl. Unfortunately, that's kind of the sad reality of where we are. But will they do it? No, I don't think they would. And you talked about it, Shayne, that trade value is not as good as you might think it is, in my opinion, at least, because you factor in that Watt will turn 31 during the season next year. There's evidence and studies that show edge defender efficiency drop off when you get into your early 30s. And he's going to need a new contract. That contract is not going to come cheap. And even though he's not coming off of his best season, he is on a historic pace, like the second highest sack rate of all time. And so that's going to cost you dearly on a new deal. And so I always describe it as the double gut punch. You are absorbing the loss of draft capital, and you are turning around to pay him a lucrative contract. And so how many teams would be willing to do that? Where's the right price? Where does the line meet there, where you're not overpaying for what you are going to be getting? So I think if I just had to venture a guess out there in this hypothetical, I think it would probably be a second plus for TJ Watt. I don't even know if you can get the first at this point. Maybe I think some team would be willing to give you a first, but to give the first and to pay him $30+ million per season is a lot to absorb for a guy who is coming off of a down year and maybe on the downward trend. And so we saw some signs of aging, maybe perhaps this season. Not that he can't bounce back next year. I think that some major changes to the defense would certainly help his efficiency go back in the right direction. We saw it with Hayward even as well. Just his improvement from the injury plague season he had in 2023 to this age 36 or 35 season he had this year, which is remarkable.
Then again, Cam is made out of, I think, something other than whatever we're made out of. I don't think we're made out of the same stuff as Cam Hayward, to put it that way.
I was just talking about Cam. I had some people over to watch draft film the other night, and we were talking about Cam, and we're like, you go look at this guy when he came out of Ohio State, and look at him right now. I mean, he's playing like 330, 335. This is a big man, and he just got bigger and stronger throughout the course of his career, and I just love it. So I can't find guys like him very often at all. All right, Shayne, I have nothing really from special teams other than I want to say the Steelers wasted a prime season of Chris Boswell, one of the best seasons we've seen.
They did, which, again, not surprising. So, but no, they certainly did. But nothing really special teams really mattered in this game. So,
no, wouldn't have made the difference at all, one way or the other. If you are a fan of the Pittsburgh Steelers and would like to support the Steel Curtain podcast, please consider subscribing to the Steel Curtain podcast on YouTube. We appreciate all of your support. If you like listening to the show, check out Josh's show that goes live post games, but now that post games are done, I believe it's going to be live Mondays, and I'll check to make sure that is correct with Josh. But we have 2 live shows every single week. We've got YouTube shorts going out. We've got interviews. I've got an interview with Merrill Hodge coming up here in a couple of weeks. If you want me to ask him a specific question, drop it in the comment section down below, and I might be able to get to that with him. So check out what we've got going on the Steel Curtain page. Also check out the website, steelcurtain.com, for all your Steelers
gonna have a lot of
news
stuff coming
and opinions.
out soon.
Yes. We've got so many thoughts to share. It's hard to keep up with them all right now. But if you like what we do, please make sure that you tell other people about it, help get the word out there, and help us get a bigger reach for our content. Absolutely. All right, we're going to move on, Shayne, and talk about the Steelers' winter meltdown, and it certainly was. When December struck, the Steelers were kind of a non-existent football team, or at least a completely irrelevant team at that point. And so we got to talk about what went wrong here down the stretch. And so if we look at the Steelers season, the way that it was going, they had a good start to the season. They were really strong in the middle of the season. Of course, we go look at now, we can pretty much chalk that up to the level of competition. You beat the Raiders. And then after beating the Raiders 32-13, you made the switch to Russell Wilson against the New York Jets, which, come to find out, the Jets sucked this year. We thought they were going to be somewhat competitive.
Not so good.
So that game doesn't look as good in hindsight. Boy, did Tomlin pick a right game to put in the guy that he wanted to make sure that he looked good for. They beat the Jets 37-15. They beat the Giants, obviously, the next game after that. And then you had the bye week. You beat the Commanders, which I think was an impressive win. You go to at Washington, you win 28-27 in that game. It literally took a last minute over the shoulder touchdown catch from Mike Williams, the one we talked about, to make that happen. You beat Baltimore the following week. And so we're impressed at this point. I mean, you're on a 5-game winning streak. You just beat 2 playoff teams, even though the Baltimore one was kind of that low-scoring slugfest and had some of those drops that we talked about before, an 18-16 football game. And then things started to go south, Shayne. That's when the Steelers lost the blizzard game in Cleveland to the Browns. They bounced back with the win over the Bengals, 44-38. They beat the Browns the week after that, and then you get destroyed by Philly, destroyed by the Ravens, destroyed by the Chiefs on Christmas Day. You lose essentially a must-win game against the Bengals in the season finale, where you could have been playing at Houston instead of at Baltimore, and then you were down 21-0 against the Ravens in the playoffs. Shayne, what was the reason for the collapse here? Was it legitimately just once you faced good competition, you showed your true colors?
I think this is kind of a layered discussion, so I'll start with the first thing, and I do think it is competition levels the number one indicator here. This team was beating up on teams that they just were better than, and when you have a team that's better than you and you're outcoached by that team as well, you typically get blown out. Like that's what happens. So you're talking about Raiders game, the Jets game, just in general, like they are not good enough to compete with the Steelers roster. And when you're not good enough to compete with the Steelers roster and the coaching isn't having like a weird week, which we know will happen sometimes, you typically get beat by the Steelers pretty hard. Like that's just what it was this year. But you go down the stretch and you look at the Eagles game. Let's start off. And yes, George Pickens missing, which means you basically have 3 number 4 receivers out there constantly, right? All respect to Calvin Austin, who I thought had a good year, but you basically have role players out there at receiver at every level of the receiver group. So that sucks, of course. Not going to be easy to move the ball. You don't move the ball at all. And you go to the Chiefs, similar story, not much going on offensively. And you just keep going down the line. The offense at the end of the day was so predicated on George Pickens making big plays specifically, or just in general creating chunk plays, that when you played against teams that were able to mitigate that and were able to go, okay, we know that if Russell Wilson can't complete 3 shots down the field, they're not going to score 20 points. Like once we were playing teams that could actually say, like, we're going to stop that. Like not just say, oh, well, we know that, but we can't do anything about it. Teams that could do something about it did, and then it was shut down. right? Like that's ultimately what I think the biggest issue was. The defense obviously faltered somewhat down the stretch as well. They weren't playing as well, especially against the pass. The secondary has been an issue for this team for a long time. It's been mitigated by the fact that they have the pass rush they have, but that production wasn't as high this year, and you saw that down the stretch as well. But ultimately, teams figured out that, and I shouldn't even say figured out, teams knew, just couldn't stop the fact that the Steelers' offense was entirely built around creating chunk plays in the run and pass game once those dried up. And you look at the yards per attempt in the last 4 games, never above 6.6 for Russell Wilson. You know, that's just not a mark that's good enough in the league to move the ball consistently. The run game, as we talked about previously, isn't good enough to offset that. They weren't able to control the clock or control the game. And ultimately, you add all those things up and you're playing teams that are better than you. You have to find ways to get advantages. They didn't do that down the stretch.
Yeah, Shane, and we talked about the first half of the season there, and right after beating the Commanders, beating the Ravens, I was optimistic, at least, about this team. But we come to find out, though, while those were good wins, the game in their playoff, the record against playoff teams was really good at that point.
It was.
They had beaten the Chargers, they had beaten the Broncos. We come to find out later, obviously, the Chargers couldn't compete in the playoffs. The Broncos couldn't compete in the playoffs. The NFL should probably go back to a 16-game schedule, and probably should go back to one fewer wild card team, because we got some terrible playoff football, like wild card weekend. It just wasn't even entertaining. Like, they were just bad games. You can see the difference in tiers between teams right now. And unfortunately, the Steelers fell into that next tier down that really wasn't a playoff caliber, contending caliber football team. So, and the question has to be asked, Shane, was this team at any point a contender this year, and then they just falter down the stretch, or were they never a contender? I'll let you go first.
They never were. And I will admit that when we were talking about this team when they were 10-3, we did. I'll say we fell for it a little bit, not as much as maybe others did in some cases, but for the most part, I think we did a little bit. And I think where we kind of went wrong and where we were getting too much hope was the fact that Russell Wilson did look like a competent NFL quarterback, and sometimes more than that. And I go back to when we were talking about the switch, and I understand, like, he had that really hot stretch in the middle of the season. I'm not saying that necessarily Fields would have been better than him or this or that. But the way the season ended is exactly why we didn't want Russell Wilson to come in and be the quarterback for this team, because he ultimately led us to the same ceiling that Justin Fields would have probably led us to. And it wasn't as good for the future, because now if it is Fields the quarterback next year, we know less about him than we would have known had he started the entire season. And again, would it have mattered in the playoffs? Would we have even made the playoffs? I don't know. But does anybody care? Does any Steelers fan out there be like, oh man, if we would have gone 9-8 instead and missed the playoffs, I'd have been so devastated? No, you wouldn't have been. You would have been like, well, okay, 9-8 is probably what we would have been anyway. Who cares? Let's move on next year. Like, that's my biggest gripe with it, is that we're fooled slightly about this team, I think, at least from what I remember us talking about. And two, like, the decision making this season overall is going to be looked at as like, great, you snuck another win or two out than you probably should have. You made the playoffs and got beat. Who cares?
Shane, well said, first of all. Secondly, that is one of my biggest gripes about this team, is they don't give a second thought ever to what is best for next year, the year beyond. It's all about the here and now. And you mentioned Justin Fields. The main reason why you and I were opposed to making the switch to Russell is because, first of all, we thought we had Russell figured out, and it turns out we did. He was the same player that he was in Denver.
Yeah.
Secondly,
more success.
Russell, beyond this year, it was a one-year sample, and beyond this year, you knew that if you wanted him back, even if you want him back, you're going to be signing a quarterback who turns 37 during the 2025 season.
Yeah.
And is on his very last legs, as compared to Fields, who is 25 years old currently at this time and has more left in the tank ahead. That's why I wanted the Steelers to roll with Fields the whole season. And then again, the hope was by week 16, 17, 18, and into the playoffs, he would be good enough to at least give you a spark, have enough big playability, use his mobility to his advantage, and give you a shot to compete, to be hot enough for 3 games to get to the Super Bowl. That was the hope. It was a long shot, admittedly, because of the quarterbacks you're going against in the AFC to begin with, but it made more sense for me to do that let alone next year and beyond. Like we would have known, like you said, we would know way more about Fields right now. Is he the guy? We could have said definitively yes or no, probably based on an entire year sample with him. The Steelers did the same thing. Mike Tomlin did the same thing with Kenny Pickett. Now, I was never a Kenny Pickett believer, but what we said in Kenny Pickett and Matt Canada, a union that didn't work out very well, we said you need to let Pickett air out the football, and if he makes mistakes and if he shows that he doesn't have what it takes, you can move on. But we got 2 years into Pickett's career. We didn't know that much more about him than we did the day the Steelers drafted him, because they wouldn't let him rip the ball. And when they did, they made sure it was to the sidelines, and it was on these speed rollouts and go balls, and he wasn't able to play to his game and kind of throw the ball over the middle of the field. And so you need to figure out who your guys are. Like sometimes figuring out your quarterback situation is more important than trying to plateau and keep your head above water for another season. Like, I would have rather the Steelers, like you said, Shayne, finish with 1 or 2 fewer wins and at least figured out what to do at quarterback, rather than to be in quarterback limbo again with not a clue as to what to do and get bounced from the first round of the playoffs.
And again, like we were giving Russ his flowers when he was playing well, and I feel like I don't regret that, because he was playing well. The problem is, at the end of the day, he still was the same quarterback that got run out of Denver, not because he was necessarily the worst quarterback in the NFL, but because he's one of the most limited quarterbacks in the NFL. For a guy who calls himself and has been called Mr. Unlimited, that's no longer the case. I'm sorry, Russ. You're not Mr. Unlimited anymore. You are certainly Mr. Limited. And with Fields, again, I don't know if we would have won as many games. I don't know if the offense would have been better or worse, but he provides you more things that he can do on the football field at this point. There's less restrictions on what you're capable of with him. You know, can he throw over the middle of the field well either? No. But could he at least potentially still develop in that area? And did he a little bit before he was benched? I think so. He's a rushing threat, obviously. We know that. Would that have been nice against teams that were taking away all of our bad receivers? Yeah, it would have been pretty nice. You know, would Najee have played better if he had someone else in the backfield to worry about besides just himself? Would Jalen have played better? Like, all these are questions we don't know the answer to now. And that's kind of the problem. We don't have the answers to those definitively. And maybe we'll get them this year. Maybe that's who it ends up being. And, you know, we'll talk about that as we go throughout the offseason. But yeah, it's just, this ultimately comes down to the fact that this team fancied itself as a contender and made decisions based on that. And instead they got another year of exactly the same thing that they always get.
Yep, for sure. And to answer the question for me, I thought in the middle of the season, right at their peak, when they beat the Ravens and Commanders, I thought there was a chance, at least a chance this team can compete. And then they showed their true colors very shortly after that, and they were the team that we thought that they were. Shayne, I want to back up here to a question real quick. Tommy, have you watched Jackson Dart? Yes, I have. I like Jackson Dart. I like him quite a bit. My problem is I have such a hard time trusting a Lane Kiffin quarterback. These guys don't have to make anything but simple reads. And so it just scares me. I was burned by Matt Corral. I'll be the first to admit. Matt Corral was my top quarterback in that class. I screwed up. The whole class sucked. 2022 was a terrible, terrible quarterback class. So I could have been right on any of those guys.
Yeah.
But I worry about quarterbacks whose job is made so easy in college, whether or not they will be able to figure out how to read a defense in the NFL. Otherwise, I do like Jackson Dart. I think he's got a good blend of traits.
As someone who has been really heavy into scouting so far this season, I've gotten through a hefty number of players. I actually, with Dart specifically, I wanted to pull it up here because it's a good conversation. Because again, quarterback is something this team has to worry about. Now, do we think it's going to be in the draft? Probably not. But it is something that we'll have to consider. And maybe they decide to take one kind of late or something, or, you know, whatever it may be. But for Jackson Dart, he is my number 9 quarterback in this class, which is not, you know, the main reason why is because, like you said, Tommy, when you watch him, you cannot remove the offense from him. And I think he is more talented than most of the quarterbacks in this class. I don't think he knows how to play the game at an NFL level. And I don't know how long it would take him to do so. So to me, I think you can't draft him high enough to expect much from him. because he probably is going to take several years to be able to run an NFL offense, in my opinion. So that's kind of where, and is that his fault necessarily entirely? Probably not, because again, it's Kiffin's offense, but he has tools at least. I'll give him that. He certainly has tools.
Yeah, Shayne, my analogy for that would be like you download this. Is there any gamers out there? You download this game from Steam you really want to play, and you figure out your graphics card isn't big enough to run the game. Like that. That's what I would worry about with Dart, just because I've seen it happen to quarterbacks from this system before. And not that he can't get it. He might be really good at reading a defense. We just don't know. And the uncertainty of it makes it a little bit scary. I will scout the quarterbacks until I'm blue in the face. I haven't got into it as much as you have, Shayne, but we've already had some film sessions, and we're going to be whizzing through these a couple times a week. We're going to be going through and doing hours of film. And so I'd love for these questions to pop back up as we continue throughout the offseason with these podcasts. So thanks.
We'll do plenty of that. Yeah. We'll be doing plenty of draft related stuff. So.
All right. And if you have any more questions for us, please drop them in the chat here. Shayne and I will see what we can get to before the end of today's show. And Shayne, our last topic for today is our biggest one. The coaching changes the Steelers must make in 2025. Now we'll talk about whether we think any of these guys are actually going to leave the team or not. But these are the ones that they have to do, in my opinion, Shayne. And I wrote these down. So if you disagree with me, let me know. I want to start with maybe the most egregious coaching performance of the year, and that is defensive coordinator Teryl Austin. Teryl Austin has to go. And if you weren't convinced before that his job should be over with, allow me to spend a few minutes to convince you right now. So last week on the pod, Shayne, I talked about Austin's low blitz rate, how he doesn't run stunts. I talked about his decision at personnel at times. We just saw Corey Trice on an island against Jamar Chase in the season finale. Who's responsible for that? That would be Teryl Austin's defense. You put Trice against the Triple Crown wide receiver, and you offer him almost virtually no safety help in that game against the best receiver in the league. What do you think is going to happen? The very following week, as promising as Trice has been, and knowing that he's the best tackling corner on this team, you don't give him a helmet against Derrick Henry in the Ravens. I mean, I'm scratching my head. You don't give Preston Smith a helmet because you give Jeremiah Moon a helmet. I mean, those are things right there that should be good enough to have him fired. But allow me to read this. And this does not come from me, though I did write an article about this. I shared it on Twitter. This comes from Matt Williamson, who did a terrific breakdown on the Steelers-Ravens game and why Austin deserves to lose his job after this. So listen to this. The Ravens used 11 personnel. So that's one tight end, one running back, and 3 wide receivers out there. Yep. They used that only 11% of the time. 1/10 of the time against the Steelers. I
would have guessed less than that, honestly. So I'm surprised there's that much.
They probably didn't have to use it at all. They probably just wanted to throw a wrinkle in there.
Probably. Yeah.
They used it 1/10 of the time against the Steelers. But what the Ravens did do is what they deployed 6 offensive linemen 22.2% of the time. That's a fourth of their plays. In addition to rolling out 300-pound fullback Patrick Ricard, who essentially acts as a 7th offensive lineman. So you were going with the biggest package that you could possibly muster up as an NFL team.
Yeah.
Essentially getting 7 offensive linemen. Yeah. 7 offensive linemen on the field. Here's how the Steelers countered that, Shayne. You're gonna like this. Pittsburgh played nickel half the game, 45% of the time. They were in nickel. They had 5 defensive backs out on the field, 180, 190-pound guys trying to play defense against 6 or 7 offensive linemen against it's paving the way for a 250-pound running back in Derrick Henry. And we wonder why this team gave up 299 rushing yards and was bounced from the playoffs. This egregious coaching display is enough to lose your job, even if the rest of the season was good. You can't call this type of game in the playoffs and stay here. You had a bunch of little guys against a bunch of big guys. Shayne, I'm going to date myself with this reference as well. You'll have no idea what I'm talking about probably. But if you go back to the regular Nintendo system, the NES.
Yeah, NES, yeah.
There was a game on there called Ice Hockey.
I've heard of it.
Great game. Great. If you haven't got it, you need it's playable right now. There was a game on there called Ice Hockey. You can pick your characters. You can have the little skinny guy that moves fast. You can have the medium guy that moves kind of fast, but can also run the little guys over. You have the big guys that can run anybody over, but move slow. The Ravens went with all big guys. The Steelers went with all tiny guys, and they were getting run over every single play and gashed. It's why they never stood a chance. Fire Terrell Austin to the moon after this display.
Yeah, before I jump in here, because I don't really have anything to disagree with on that. R Barley 18 chimes in, which is something he said this a lot, and I understand why he says this. Yeah, Austin is such a puppet. He should have Tomlin elbow deep in his backside at all times. Austin, as much as a DC as I am a billionaire. Well, I hope you are a billionaire, but I know I'm assuming you are not based on this comment. But realistically, again, like, I'm not going to pretend like I know exactly how much Austin does. I'm not going to pretend exactly that I know exactly how much of the game plan is entirely on him. However, if nothing else, you need someone else in the room besides him. Like, regardless of who's calling plays, who's making decisions, who this and that, whatever, somebody else has got to be in there to help out, because we've seen this defense go through changes when they've gone through defensive coordinator changes in terms of structure, in terms of how they attack offenses. That does change from year to year and from coordinator to coordinator. Obviously Tomlin is going to make the ultimate decision in terms of the direction of the defense and how he wants to play, yada yada, whatever. There's too many good defensive coaches out there, more so every year, because it feels like, obviously, offensive coordinators and offensive coaching is at a premium. That's who gets hired for a lot of the top jobs as head coaches and things like that. Offensive coordinators are constantly getting poached and moved and up and down, everything else. Defensive coaches just kind of sometimes sit there and just coach the same team for a long time. You look at Spagnuolo with the Chiefs. Obviously, he's had issues as a head coach that plays into it. But we had a guy in the building, Brian Flores, who probably would be doing a little bit better than Austin's doing right now. And I know he has his own issues against specifically the Rams and the Lions for whatever reason, but that's beside the point. There's too many good defensive minds out there that could theoretically be helping this team innovate, or at least someone that, what Tomlin needs to do, in my opinion, at this point, is just basically, who do you respect more than anybody else in the league that you from afar, like, I love what that guy's doing. Try to poach him and get him over here and say, listen, I'm going to give you more control of the defense than I've ever given anybody. Go at it, figure it out. Like, take all these players that we've accumulated, many of them very good, and try to figure out how to best use them. Will he do that? No, he's not going to do that. But that's what he probably should be doing. And I think until he does, we're going to see similar results on defense, especially in the playoffs.
100%, Shayne. And I've literally heard this argument from people in Steelers media. I won't mention anybody by name, but there are those who said Brian Flores was never going to stay long-term anyway.
Sure.
You know how I want to respond to that, Shayne? Let me ask, I'll respond with a question. Would you rather have a good defensive coach for 2 years, or would you rather have a bad defensive coach for as long as you want to keep him?
Right.
Because that's essentially what the Steelers' decision came down to.
Yeah. And guess what? Flores has been with the Vikings for a couple of years now. Yeah, maybe he's going to be a head coach after this year, but maybe he won't be. Maybe teams like, you know what? He's better as defensive coordinator. And there's a lot of guys like that are just better defensive coordinators than
in worst case scenario, Shayne, if you have to stream defensive coordinators every 2 to 4 years, whatever it ends up being, because they're getting poached from you, congratulations. Good. You got a coach that deserved to be poached, not an Arthur Smith who may not deserve to be poached, but still, and we'll see if he gets poached. But I also have this other stat here. I cut it up today, and let me see if I can find it. It's right here somewhere. Oh yeah. So Terrell Austin, before he came to Pittsburgh as an assistant coach, he was eventually promoted to defensive coordinator, take over for Keith Butler. In his previous 2 years as DC, Shayne, things didn't go very well. In Detroit in 2017, his defense was 27th in yards allowed, 21st in points allowed. And then in 2018, right before coming to the Steelers, he was 32nd in yards allowed, 30th in points allowed. That is the guy, Tomlin. That's the guy that you went out and hired and eventually made your defensive coordinator. It's shocking that we're seeing the results that we are right now, Shayne.
Yeah, again, like, this has been a player-driven defense for a while, right? And I think part of the problem is Tomlin, I think, expects a lot of his players, as he should, but he puts too much on the talent of the defensive roster and not enough on the schematic side of things, not on the how do I get TJ Watt to be the best version of himself? How do I get Minka Fitzpatrick to get back to what he was as a safety earlier on? How do I get Joey Porter Jr. to stop grabbing onto everything he sees like he's a kid in the candy store whenever he's 6 years old? Like, how do I do those things? Instead, he's like, those guys are really good, really talented players. I'm going to let them go do their thing. That works when the defense is so good that it doesn't matter. When you have so much talent, you don't have so much talent. You have a lot, but you don't have enough talent across the board to justify playing that way. And even if you did, why not try to maximize that? Like it's just, it's very weird. It's very weird.
Yeah, Shayne. And the other point that we haven't even discussed here is that when Austin came onto this team, he inherited 3 perennial first-team All-Pro players in TJ Watt, Minka Fitzpatrick, and Cameron Hayward. Those players since have been a little bit less effective, especially this year. Not Hayward as much, but Watt and Minka certainly. I mean, Minka has 1 interception since 2022. Oddly enough, Terrell Austin's first year was the 2022 season. Minka was good in 2022, but 2023 and 24, he was not so much. And so we have to wonder why. You're getting these guys in the prime years of their careers, and that wasn't enough. You spend the most money on defense of any team in the league, and that wasn't enough to be anything more than just an above average defense. Like, there are so many things pointing to the fact that this defense is underachieving, even if they have holes, even if Beanie Bishop and Cam Sutton are not the answer at slot corner, you need another defensive interior guy, whatever. You have enough talent on this defense where you should not be having this type of performances that you are. And so to me, it's very, very clear. I mean, Austin has to go. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He has 1 year left on his deal. I do not care. Eat whatever that rest of that contract is, and you move on from him. And you have him go coach somewhere else, because I don't want any part of him on the team at this point. It was a bad experiment, and things got progressively worse over the years since hiring Austin 3 years ago. I just don't want any part of that anymore. The next one I have, Shayne, on the list, and I want to see if you agree with me on this one as well, is offensive line coach Pat Meyer. It's not good enough. It never made sense to me, especially with Arthur Smith. If you're trying to run a wide zone offense, you got a gap line runner. I didn't get the fit. I didn't understand that when they hired Arthur Smith, would they have not changed offensive line coaches to one who fits with the program of what they're trying to do? And not only that, Shayne, the second part of this is clearly outside of Zach Frazier, who had a good rookie year. I think McCormick had certainly flashed, at least as a rookie.
Yeah.
You weren't getting the development out of Broderick Jones that you wanted. You put up with some bad years of Dan Moore. Like, it just wasn't going very well. And from all the time that he's been here so far, we just haven't seen much improvement collectively from the line.
I think the biggest problem now too is like the development aspect, like you said. Like, they're just not developing guys at all. Like, Frazier had a great rookie season, but that's because he's already a great player. Like, he's not a guy that I viewed as like this project at center. He was a plug and play starter type guy coming out of West Virginia, and that's what he was. And I'm not saying he won't also improve from this point, but like, you weren't expecting him to be this guy like, oh man, we have to coach him up on all these things and teach him this and that. It's like, no, he's ready to go. It's just, how much more can he get better? McCormick, an unbelievable athlete, but a 6-year player. So again, not really a true developmental guy. So he's also a guy that I thought would be able to play. And then you have 2 athletic tackles who, again, all the athletes on the offensive line indicate like, oh yeah, definitely we're running wide zone, like get out, reach block, do all the stuff up the field. Yeah. And then they have a guy who just doesn't do that. Like, it's not what his main thing is. They absolutely need to make a move just for that reason, if nothing else, because the talent doesn't line up with the scheme that they're trying to do. Like with what Meyer teaches, right? Like, that's not what he's going to be best at. They need to find somebody more from that, like, again, from the wide zone tree of thinking of like, how do I get these guys out on the perimeter? How do I get them up the field? Because outside of Frazier, everyone that's a projected starter for this team, especially if they were to bring Daniels back, which I'm hoping they can on a cheaper deal because of the injury with him, all these guys are great athletes pretty much. Like, all of them are like, their tools athletically are what makes them the prospects they were or the players that they are. You need somebody who can teach that and kind of maximize that ability.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, they've tried it long enough at this point, and it hasn't yielded good enough results despite your investments in the offensive line that it's time to move on, in my opinion. And even go back to, again, Shayne, the Pat Meyer hire in the first place. I wasn't really thrilled about it because his offensive lines where he was before weren't all that good. And so
No.
he's been around the league for a long time, but if your track record isn't impressive, then what does it matter if you're a long tenured assistant coach in the NFL? Like I need you to be more than that. Hasn't been enough. I would cut ties with Meyer this offseason, and I would try something else. Like you said, something that fits with the program, something in the Shanahan mold of the wide zone actual. If you're sticking with that scheme, you need an offensive line coach who knows how to teach that type of technique. And so I would make a switch there as well. Shayne, the next name I have on the list, position that needs to be changed. This one's not going to happen unless Arthur Smith gets poached, but offensive coordinator, the Steelers signed, and the reason is because the Steelers signed Smith to a 3-year contract last year. They're going to give him more than 1 year. This is the same team that gave Matt Canada nearly 3 years before late in the third season. They said, we can't do this another game. They gave Randy Fichtner 2 years. Yeah, you're going to give Arthur Smith more than a year. And I understand that. I understand why you're going to give him that opportunity to show his scheme and show that he can kind of bounce back from a pedestrian offensive showing this year. Maybe we'll get the right pieces in place, find a number 2 receiver, what have you. But the reason I'm opposed to this from the beginning, and the reason why I would get rid of him, is because your offense legitimately does not have enough firepower in its arsenal under Arthur Smith's playbook to go toe-to-toe with the Bills, the Chiefs, the Ravens, and some of these other teams up and coming in the AFC where the Steelers are getting left behind. They are too conservative. Under Arthur Smith, it was the problem they had. And again, I know the overarching problem here. We all know where it stems from. Okay. You don't even have to mention his name, but
we know.
This is why Arthur Smith was brought in. I can't get on board with a run heavy first team that doesn't have enough passing upside to be a team that can put up points.
I mean, yeah, you kind of nailed it in terms of the problem with Arthur Smith. It's more so that he's the only way he'd be an effective offensive coordinator for a playoff level team is if he went to a team that already had all the pieces in place. If he went to a team that had the quarterback in place, had some running backs he could work with, had enough receiving weapons, all whatever. Yeah, he'll get him up to speed. He'll get him into a position where they're going to be successful. He's not going to coach this unit up to make them better than they are. And I said that before. That's kind of the biggest problem with him is I think he is firmly in that like 20 to 14 range of offensive coordinators. He is average. He will get what you give him out of the players for the most part, as long as they, kind of buy into what he's doing. But he's not elevating anything. He's not going to make this group like significantly better than they should be. He's not this type of coach that's going to do that. And guess what? So is every other coach this team seems to ever have. So it fits. And I think that I've been thinking about this for a while because I'm definitely going to be, speaking of stillcurtain.com, going to have some stuff coming up here very soon. I know that we're doing as far as because they've been eliminated. We have a lot of stuff coming out around that and conversations about this team moving forward. One of the things that I've always been very interested in is what exactly is the problem with Tomlin in terms of hiring coaches? Like, where is he consistently going wrong? And I think the problem when you look at these guys, and it all starts to form a pattern when you look at it deeper, he prioritizes experience over production. He prioritizes guys that he knows has done this before, generally. And has a track record of just being in the spot that they are in long and have shown that they can at least do it, maybe not at a high level, but can do it, over swinging for someone who, maybe they don't have the experience in the role yet. Maybe they haven't shown much at the NFL level in terms of play calling or execution or whatever else. But there's someone who is up and coming and has a background that indicates they could be very good at this. He does not want to take the swing on those guys. He wants something that he can look at and say, this guy has done this, this, and this in the league. Yeah, maybe he's never been great, but he's done it. That's what this hire felt like when it happened.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you nailed it with that. Arthur Smith is not going to be fired, Shayne, but do you think that he ultimately gets poached for a head coaching job?
No, but I sure hope so. Just because at least something happens, right?
Mhm.
No, but honestly, part of the problem is one, he shouldn't get a job. Like, let's just be honest about that. No offense to Arthur, if he's not, he should not get an NFL head coaching job again already. It just shouldn't have. Maybe never, but definitely not right now. And secondly, if he does get poached, the next hire is not going to be better. I'm sorry. There's no reason for me to think so.
Mhm.
It's going to be some other offensive coordinator that has been fired in the past couple of years and is probably currently coaching on like a college team or is currently like sitting at home waiting to be hired by someone. Like that's what's going to be, and we know that. That's part of the problem with it. Is sure it be change, but we've seen that this team, when they do decide to change something, usually it just means a different version of the same thing they already had. So
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I think that even if he were to be poached for a head coaching job, and I will also say no, that he doesn't get one, and because it's just the track record is not good enough, I think there's going to be better options out there still. But even if he were to be poached, you have to believe, based on Mike Tomlin's philosophy of winning, he's going to go out and sign another offensive coordinator who is of similar mind in that they want to run a fairly conservative, take care of the football and play good defense game plan that is going to minimize risk, which also stunts the upside of your offense as well. So I think it would be something in the wheelhouse of Smith if it's not Smith that's here.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think he goes anywhere. And going back to, we didn't give our O-line coach predictions, but I think that Pat Meyer is gone. I'm going to say that
I think
he's
so
gone.
too. That's the one I think is going to happen because it just makes too much sense, and it's like an easy one for them to do where it's like, hey, we made a big move, sort of, guys, and like some people aren't
There's your
going to care about
scapegoat,
that.
right?
Yeah,
Right
like
there it is.
some people aren't going to care about it, but I do think it would be a good thing to do. Obviously, that's why we talked about it. Now who they're going to hire, I don't know, but probably will be similar. I don't know.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's frustrating though watching this team go through eras where they have really good offensive line coaching, like Mike Munchak.
Man, I'd take Mike Munchak right now. I don't care.
Oh my goodness, I'd take him over any of the coaches that this team has right now. Like it's
fair.
That niche role to be able to find a really good O-line coach like that, Callahan, Munchak, it's very, very valuable. And so I'd love for them to be able to get that guy. There's just so few of those guys out there that are the difference makers like that.
Yeah.
And that brings me to one more coaching change the Steelers should make, Shayne. I will preface that they will not do this. There's already been reports the Steelers will not do this. And he himself said that it's not going to happen and basically laughed off the chance of him entertaining trades from other teams. Mike Tomlin has to go. I don't care. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I'd like to hear your reasoning at this point. The Steelers are on an 8-year drought without a playoff win. They won 3 playoff games over the last 14 seasons. And I want to give you a little perspective with everything that we do here. And so if we talk about Tomlin being on this pedestal kind of with the top coaches in the league, during that same 14-year span, Shayne, some of the coaches I'm about to tell you right now retired. Some of the coaches took a gap between their coaches, between their head coaching years. And some of these coaches didn't start as a head coach until 2017. Regardless, Mike Tomlin's 3 playoff wins in that same span, this 14-year span, Andy Reid and Bill Belichick, 16 playoff wins. Circumstances are different. I understand that. Tom Brady, Patrick Mahomes, that's going to be different. John Harbaugh, 9 playoff wins. Pete Carroll, 9 playoff wins. Didn't coach this year. Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay, younger head coaches, didn't start until 2017. 8 playoff wins during this span. Mike McCarthy had a gap it took a break from coaching, came back, coached for Dallas, has 6 playoff wins. Sean Payton had a gap in coaching, took a year off, came back,
missed a whole year for other reasons.
Missed a whole year for other reasons. Went to a bad Denver team, 5 playoff wins. Tomlin has coached longer than every name on this list except for Harbaugh and Andy Reid, which he's coached an equal amount of time in that 14-year span. And his postseason production is not even close to comparable as the top NFL coaches on this list. If you want to argue that Tomlin should be a head coach, that's fine. If you want to argue that he's been on the same tier as these coaches, that is ludicrous to me, because I don't care what you do in the regular season. If you are not producing at all in the postseason, and he essentially hasn't, it doesn't matter. So that's my first point there. Shayne, I'll give you a chance for rebuttal, and then I'm going to come in with something else.
I think that that's obviously a very fair thing to talk about is the playoff issues. Like that's ultimately what the sport is about. It's about getting the playoffs, winning Super Bowls, the whole 9 yards, especially in Pittsburgh, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the bigger overarching issue with Tomlin as the head coach of this team now, specifically, is it's been very clear for a while that his brand of coaching and his brand of football only works under very specific circumstances, right? That just aren't very easy to maintain in the modern NFL. First, you have to have a quarterback that is a true franchise quarterback. And because of how much he's involved in player acquisition, because of how much power he has in the organization, not having one does fall on him to some degree. Not, entirely, but it does fall on him to some degree. The second thing he has to have is a defense full of playmakers where he can kind of allow them to do their thing and be the stalwarts and be the ones who drive the force in that case, or the driving force of the defense. And he's had that recently, but there was a stretch when Ben was playing at some of his best where he didn't have that, right?
Yeah.
Where he didn't have a lot of that going on. So there's these different eras of his coaching tenure where you had the initial success, right? Where obviously there's a lot of players that he didn't acquire, but did elevate, in my opinion, did bring them up to the championship standard, did help them in that regard. And this was also when Ben was blossoming into his truly a franchise quarterback. And then there's the lull in the mid 2010s where the defense wasn't good enough because it aged. A lot of those guys aged out. The offense exploded, but they weren't able to play complementary football for several years in there. And now we're in the era of the offense is just simply not good enough. The quarterback's not good enough. And the defense, as good as it can be, is still too player driven and not enough scheme and trying to elevate those guys in those ways. The specific circumstances that he had that got him 2 Super Bowl appearances and a Super Bowl victory are just so hard to attain in the NFL that I do think at this point for both sides, because I think this is another thing where I think the conversation gets muddied because too often I think it's either or. There's people who think he is a bad coach, and then there's people who think that he's too good to fire.
Mm-hmm.
The real answer is in the middle, and I hate to be that guy that's like, actually, like it's not this. He is more than good enough to be an NFL head coach that has a lot of success, but it can't be here anymore, in my opinion. That's the discrepancy.
Yep.
It's not that he shouldn't be a head coach. It's not that he isn't a maybe even great one in certain situations. It's that it's run its course with Pittsburgh. They're too far away from what his vision as a coach is to be successful for him to find that success here. He needs to search for it elsewhere if he wants to get back to that level. And Pittsburgh has to be willing to say, okay, we're not able to give you what you specifically need to be as successful as you have been early in your career. So we're going to move on and we're going to mutually part ways in a way that makes sense for both sides. Because I do think it would make sense for both sides. This is not just Pittsburgh needs to get rid of him and Tomlin. I don't think they need each other anymore. And they haven't for a while, realistically.
You're right, Shayne. It's not about Tomlin being this awful NFL coach that you just can't win with. Obviously, he will raise your floor. At the very least, he can make you a competitive team. But things are beyond stale at this point. I think everybody knows. I think everybody knows. Even the national media is starting to recognize that at this point. Most of them, at least, that are actually been paying attention to what's going on.
Yeah.
But I think the Andy Reid example is perfect. You go in Philly, you're a tremendous coach for the Eagles, but you were continually falling just short, and you could never get over that hump.
Yeah.
As much as you tried to change and go through whatever, change your roster, squeezing competent quarterback play out of McNabb and everybody that you had there, and then they make a change, and it worked out for both sides. The Eagles won a Super Bowl 2 years later with Doug Peterson. Even though he was a lesser head coach, obviously, they still were able to win a Super Bowl because of the change that it inspired. And then Reid obviously goes on and has a tremendous career with the Chiefs. A similar change could benefit the Steelers. But I do want to go back, and I want to even add more context to
Mm-hmm.
this 14-year window that we've been experiencing, and people say, well, why don't you go back to 15 years? Well, sure. Yes. You go back to 15 years, the Steelers won the Super Bowl in 2010. Yes. But I'm saying the most recent sample is always the most relevant. If I take the first 4 years of Tomlin's career, it's fantastic. I mean, 2 Super Bowl appearances, a tremendous record, tremendous playoff record. But what's most relevant is the most recent sample. And so from 2011 to 2014, that's 4 straight years, the Steelers did not have a postseason win. In 2015, the Steelers beat A.J. McCarron and the Cincinnati Bengals
And it took
in
a
a
lot.
game where, and I want to even add context to that. It took a lot.
Yeah.
Vontez Burfict hit late in the game that basically gift wrapped the game of the Steelers. And when the Bengals were putting the game on ice, just literally running the clock out of the game, Shazier came up with the most unlikely play imaginable, forced a fumble, and recovered his own fumble to give the Steelers a fighting chance in that game. That's one of the 3 wins right there. Okay.
Yeah.
The following year, then they were bounced after that game. The following year in 2016, that was their closest run since in the last 15 years here. In 2016, the Steelers beat up on Matt Moore in the Miami Dolphins.
That's the Matt Moore game where Bud Dupree almost killed him. I remember.
Yes. One of the biggest hits you'll ever see in the NFL is a 270-pounder going 20 miles an hour and just derailing him. So they knocked Matt Moore out of the game. They were down to the 3rd-string quarterback. And then they won that game. And the following game, they won an 18-16 game in Arrowhead against Alex Smith and the Chiefs. And then they were bounced from the tournament in ugly fashion by the Patriots. Those are the 3 wins. That's it. You beat A.J. McCarron, you beat Matt Moore, you beat Alex Smith. In the last 14 years, those are the only 3 quarterbacks and 3 teams that you have beaten in the playoffs, Shayne. And that's why it's so constrained. And then after that, you had an 8-year drought that is continuing to this day without a playoff win. So that's the biggest problem right there. Now, I want to add here, because I've got so much to say on Tomlin and so little time to do it. But if we use that sample, Shayne, there was a previous head coach in the NFL, a respectable one, who in his final 4, because I want to compare apples.
No, I know.
In his final 14 seasons coaching, he had 8 postseason appearances, 11 playoff games, and 3 playoff wins. Tomlin's 14-year sample now, 9 postseason appearances, 12 playoff games, and 3 playoff wins. Essentially the same there. That head coach was Marty Schottenheimer.
Yeah.
Okay. And take it for what you will. I don't care. If you say it's just a ludicrous example, whatever. I'm using a 14-year example. I'm not cherry picking.
Yeah, this is not
this is a small number now.
Sample size at this point, unfortunately.
So, and Schottenheimer was a good coach, and especially in the first half of his career, he had a really high win percentage. He just never really successful in the playoffs. The difference, obviously, Tomlin has a Super Bowl win in 2 appearances, but since then, they were identical in the final 14 years of Tomlin, the final 14 years of Schottenheimer. Almost identical down to the very playoff win. They both had 3 playoff wins during that stretch. Now, here are some of the excuses, Shayne, that people give to keep Tomlin. And these are, I literally wrote these down after seeing comments to my tweets or seeing them on X, whatever. And another team would hire him immediately.
They probably should. It doesn't matter.
Sure. You could do a lot worse.
It doesn't matter.
The grass isn't always greener. And you might regret it.
Maybe.
A lot of these came from notable NFL figureheads too.
Yeah.
But my dilemma here, Shayne, is if the only reasonable defense for Mike Tomlin at this point is you have to resort to fear tactics and say, well, you could do worse. Things could get a whole lot worse than this. That's not a defense. Obviously, they could get worse. They get worse with anybody. You could say that. But where is the actual logical reasoning to keep him with what we've witnessed so far, unless you truly are in favor of plateauing at 9 to 10 wins every year and you want the team to sell tickets? Like if that's not your argument and you're arguing for postseason success and eventually another Super Bowl, how can you use fear tactics as a way to defend Mike Tomlin? Like, that's my question.
And again, this argument's been around for a long time, and it's not that they're wrong. It's that it's not the point. Like, it's not really what matters. Yes, if they fire Tomlin and hire someone else, statistically speaking, across the league, it is more likely that that coach is a worse coach than him, than he's a better coach than him. That's not the point, though. It's not about whether or not you're trying. It's you have to do something different in order to get anywhere. Because if you get worse with another coach, guess what? That means you might have a chance to, I don't know, draft somebody in the top 10, draft a quarterback who comes out in the next couple classes that is worth tanking for, or not even tanking, but just being in a position to draft. Maybe you blow the team up and things suck for a little while, but you end up getting better long term. Or even better, maybe the next guy you hire is just the right guy and you immediately are better. But the point is, it's different. At some point, you need to do something different, regardless of the consequences of that. Because yes, someone is going to hire Tomlin the second he gets fired, most likely. Someone is going to immediately be like, hey, we need to interview this guy, get him in, but whatever. And good, they probably should. There's teams out there that should do that, realistically. Like, I think a team like Cowboys, who have a quarterback that is, as much as Prescott isn't the best quarterback in the world, he is better than anything they've had in a very long time in Pittsburgh. Maybe he would be able to work with that because he could help the defense out, get them up to speed, all that stuff. There's teams out there that might benefit from Tomlin being their coach because they need that type of coach. The Steelers don't need this type of coach right now. We are not good enough in the areas that he needs the team to be good enough to maximize what he does. And it's been that way for a while, and it's not changing anytime soon. I don't think that, as much as Khan has done a good job with the roster, there's so much work to do to get them to the point where he could use his brand of coaching to get them to be a Super Bowl contender, that we're probably going to have to extend him again before he'd be able to do it, realistically.
Yeah.
So,
and Shayne, you said it. The Steelers went from null to cower, and it worked. They went from cower to Tomlin,
and it worked. Initially. Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that it's guaranteed to work this next time, or that you're going to have a coach that lasts 16, 18, 20 years in the NFL. They've been very fortunate that way. And they've made some great hires, but they can't be so fearful as to say, we're so afraid to turn this next page of the franchise when things are the way that they are right now. And so to raise one more point about Tomlin here, Shayne, because I know everybody always asks about this. And so I made a post on it. The coordinators are the problem, is what people will say as a scapegoat sometimes. But Mike Tomlin hires his coaching staff. The talent is an issue, but Mike Tomlin insists on having his hands in the front office, free agency, and the draft processes. The game plan is too conservative, but Mike Tomlin's philosophy is minimizing risk in trying to take the football away. The overarching problem here is Mike Tomlin. I think you can go higher than that if you want to. You can say it's a Rooney problem. And I don't have an issue with you saying that either.
It is to a degree as well. Yeah. But
so we can't get rid of the Rooneys. We can't
we can't do nothing about that, unfortunately. Well, depending on how you feel about it.
And we have a comment in here. What about your GM and quarterback? The GM, I'm fine with the GM. I'm going to give Omar Khan and Andy Weidel more than 2 years of draft picks to show they can turn this team around. I've been impressed with the draft picks. Broderick doesn't look like a great pick right now, but the rest of them look like they found tremendous value, and you found some cornerstone players that you can start to build around. I don't fault them right now nearly as much as I fault the guy that's been here for 18 years and has 3 playoff wins over the last 14. And so that is the issue that we're faced with right now. Tomlin is, I've used this analogy before for any nerds out there. Tomlin is becoming the emperor, like in Star Wars, and he has too much power that you can't take it away from him at this point. It's going to have to be forcefully removed by firing him, because he has his hands, he has in every single basket right now. He wants to go on the scouting trail and play GM. Well, guess what? If you're a head coach, focus on being a head coach so that you can do that job to the best of your ability. When you stretch yourself too thin, you become what Bill Belichick was in the very late stages of his career when he sucked at drafting but was good at coaching. Or you become like Bill O'Brien was for the Texans before he got fired, when you tried to play coach and GM. It doesn't work. Focus on being a head coach and getting your team back on track, because I'm sick of everybody saying it's the coordinator's problem. It's a talent issue. It's the game plan. I'm like, Tomlin chooses all of those things, and he's responsible for them.
That's the biggest problem. And I think we can leave off with this with Tomlin. And we'll talk more about staff and everything else as we go through the offseason and see what changes. But I agree that the biggest problem for this team, like on a week-to-week basis, is the fact their coordinators aren't good enough. But guess who hires the coordinators, guys? Mike Tomlin hires the coordinators, and he has shown throughout his entire career that he's simply not good at doing that. Now, I don't know why specifically. I don't know what his thought process actually is. We can guess based on what he does, but he just simply isn't good at hiring people around him. And I think he doesn't give them enough free reign to do their thing, and that's another big problem with him. And it goes into he does have his hand in too many things. He needs to step back and look at the way that, and again, this is the trendy version of Tomlin nowadays, or what people like to think of with him. Dan Campbell is the gold standard for the head coach that isn't a play caller necessarily on either side of the ball, but understands how to just do his job.
Delegate responsibility too.
Like in the quote, I don't have the exact quote up, but he's like, the best thing you can do as a head coach is hire the right people around you. Like your best attribute as a head coach is being a recruiter of guys who can bring in people who want to build your vision, but also are smart enough to know that if I don't think this is working, or if it's not working, they can figure it out for me. They can help me out. There's a reason why Ben Johnson has been there for as long as he has, because he has been given the freedom to do his thing, to build himself up as a play caller. And now he's probably going to get a head coaching job, and Campbell's going to be on the trail again looking for somebody, but he's going to prioritize, like, I need to find the best guy for the job. It doesn't matter if he agrees with me. It doesn't matter if he agrees with this or that. Who's going to build my offense up as good as it can? That's all he ever cares about. And it's clear that he does, because that's why he has been so successful with Detroit. That's the mentality that Tomlin has to adopt, or it is eventually going to end with him probably not being on this team for much longer, especially after the extension is done, and also probably not having the success he wants to have.
Absolutely, Shayne. Dan Campbell is prototype what you look for, in that if you are not going to call the offense or defense, you need
CEO type coach. That's what
you need to be the best delegator in the world. And Tomlin has been so bad at hiring, so he's kind of in some ways has been the opposite of a Dan Campbell. And Campbell was even willing to let Ben Johnson make more money than him, even though he's the head coach of the team, because he wants the best coaches possible on his football team. So it makes total sense. Shayne, I want to leave us with this for today. I'm going to read through the Steelers season statistics where they finished real quick. And then I want you to tell me where you think they are right now after this season in terms of rank among the 32 teams in the league. They were one of the 14 teams that made the playoffs, and there were 18 teams that did not. But give me a rank after you hear these. The Steelers were 19th in points per game this year, 23rd in yards, 25th in yards per play, 25th in rushing yards per play, 14th in pass yards per play, 20th in DVOA offense, 20th in EPA offense. Get to the defensive side of the ball, they were 8th in opponent points, 15th in opponent yards, 16th in opponent yards per play, 8th in defensive DVOA, 9th in defensive EPA, and collectively their DVA was 15th in the NFL. After everything that we've seen this year, we've watched a ton of football this year, and we watched obviously all the Steelers games at least once, multiple times. Where would you rank the Steelers among the 32 teams right now entering the 2025 offseason?
They are, weirdly enough, and it's the DVOA kind of sums it up, like they are bang on average football team. Like they are a 16th best, like fringe playoff, but makes the playoffs because of stuff that they managed to make happen early in the season. Like this is a team that will beat teams that are worse than them most of the time. They will beat teams that are as good or a little bit better than them a lot of the time too, because they will play up to that competition often, and they will lose to teams that are clearly better than them. Like they're a purely average football team across the board, because the offense is slightly below average and the defense is slightly above average in a lot of metrics. It's kind of funny it works out that way, but that is what this team does. They are a defense skewed team that, because of the high variance of defense in the NFL and the high variance of their offensive game plan, equals a very average football team on the whole.
Yeah, and I think the collection of the statistics doesn't lie this year. I think
that's
who the Steelers are.
Yeah,
and I would agree, Shayne, wholeheartedly. I think the Steelers are either the 15th or 16th best team in the league, especially if you were to go individually, which we're not going to do right now, and go team by team. You would probably come to that conclusion. If you want to do that and leave us a comment and tell us where you think they land, go ahead and do that. But I think that you'll find it's probably hard to argue that they're much higher than that, especially with what we witnessed from this team the final 5-6 games of the season here. All right, we go live on YouTube every single Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time. As you can see, we have some longer shows. I love off-season content, Shayne.
Yes,
I love it. To me, this is our wheelhouse here, because we can really dive deep into this team. And during the season, sometimes we have to go week by week. We can't do the big picture looks.
Right.
So we're going to be talking about a ton of things this year: the quarterback situation, all the upcoming roster moves, free agency, the NFL draft, Stick with us for that. It's going to be lots and lots of fun. But we go live every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time on YouTube. Also, check out Josh Yoris' show live on Mondays at 1:30. Thank you again for joining us on the show today. You can follow Shayne on X at Shayne Kubas. You can follow me on X at Tommy Jaggi. You can download the Still Curtain podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube or ask Alexa to play the Still Curtain Steelers podcast. And thanks again for listening to the Still Curtain podcast.